Welcome to the Crown Council Mentor of the Month, where we connect with dental experts, leaders, and specialists in their field to copy genius.
Welcome to the Crown Council Mentor of the Month. This is Steve Anderson, and our guest today is well known to Crown Council members. He's been a mentor and a resource partner for many years, Jack Fairchild, who among his many designations is a certified clinical nutritionist. And that means different things to different people. Let me explain exactly what Jack does so that you have this in perspective. So Jack spends his days helping people stay and get healthy naturally. So he uses a variety of tools to assess what's going on, everything from blood tests to hormone tests, all kinds of different tests to determine what is the root of what's going on. And then with natural means, with supplements and other means, then tries to bring everything into balance. So Jack's been a great resource to us for many years. He's been a certified clinical nutritionist for over 25 years. He's worked with hundreds of professionals. He's worked with hundreds of Crown Council dentists to help them get healthy and stay healthy. So in today's podcast, what I've asked him to do is to focus his comments and his really instruction on stress. And stress means a lot of things to a lot of people. He's going to focus in on 6 stressors that have to be managed. And these are very applicable in dentistry, especially those that are providers, because dentistry is a physically demanding profession, and managing all of the things that might compromise your overall health and well-being becomes a major piece of the whole wellness plan. So with that, Jack Fairchild is going to share with us the 6 primary sources of stress and what you can do to keep them in check. So Jack, take it away.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate you having me on today. Let's get started. Managing stress in stressful times. We want to talk about what I have termed over the years the 6 vectors of stress and the role that they play in your health. So we want to just start with the basic. What is stress? Stedman's dictionary defines stress as reactions of the body to forces of a deleterious nature, infections, various abnormal states that tend to disturb the normal physiologic function of the body. What we're going to find out today is that there's really a lot more to it than just that. So what I'm going to do is
in other words, I think that means that stuff that messes you up, right? That's not the real sophisticated definition.
That's right. But it's anything anything that's negative or perceived to be negative to you.
Got it.
And so, if we look at a traditional, just a typical healthy stress response, and we'll kind of look at this graph here from left to right. Generally what happens is a stressor comes along, and it's listed here, mental, emotional, chemical, structural, and it can be any number of things, but the stressor stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. The nervous system then stimulates the hypothalamus and pituitary of the brain, and this causes the adrenal glands to pump out adrenaline and subsequently to pump out cortisol. Now, we've all experienced adrenaline at some point, so we pretty much know what that has to do with, but the increase in cortisol is the thing we're really going to be talking about today. And generally speaking, what would happen is whenever a stressor arises, we pump out the adrenaline, we deal with the stress response, the cortisol comes in, and it counterbalances the adrenaline and everything settles back down to normal, and basically life is good again. It's back to normal.
Okay.
But what occurs in today's world is we can see what we call chronic maladaptive stress responses. So it's essentially the same type of setup where we run through the stressor, we get the stimulation, we get the release of the adrenal hormone, adrenaline, as well as cortisol. But what happens is you'll see here kind of in the middle of this slide towards the bottom is it mentions a reduced sensitivity of the brain centers to inhibit the feedback. The point being is that cortisol becomes chronic because what occurs is people begin to respond to their everyday ongoing stressors almost as if it's the end of the world. The body's saying, oh my goodness, I need to be in fight or flight all day long.
Can you define just in layman's terms what cortisol is and what it does?
Yes, specifically, it is a hormone that is released by the body in times of stress. And so we're back to that, that word again, stress. In times of stress and or when blood sugar levels drop low. It's designed to actually counterbalance low glucose levels. So what will occur then is as this chronic stress response goes on and on, cortisol then has many damaging effects if the body is expected to just continue pumping out this cortisol on a daily basis.
Okay.
So you'll also see over here, the very far right of the slide, you're going to find it mentions losses of magnesium, potassium, calcium. The adrenaline creates high oxidation. It causes sugar imbalances, causes fat increase. So all this kind of works, again, coming out of the stress response. So we'll go on to the next slide here and brings up the question that you just asked, which is what is cortisol? And as we mentioned, steroid hormone, it's released in response to stress and low blood glucose concentrations. I want to just kind of briefly here, if we can, paint a picture, paint some correlates with elevated cortisol. So we look kind of here in the middle of the screen, you're going to see the green box that is listed elevated cortisol. And you'll see to the top left, it's connected with obesity. So cortisol causes us to store body fat. Kind of bottom left, you're going to see cortisol causes us to become more insulin resistant. In other words, excess elevated cortisol causes the body to become resistant to insulin. Therefore, we are less capable of managing blood sugar. And from this pattern, we can see all types of things from obviously diabetes to heart disease to weight gain, high cholesterol, high triglyceride levels. And, you know, for a lot of the dentists that I've talked to over the years, one of the big common complaints is kind of ongoing inflammatory issues, aches and pains. Well, insulin is the #1 inflammatory hormone in the body. And all of this comes as a direct result of elevated cortisol.
Wow.
We'll also see, I'll point out a couple of other ones here. If we look a little further to the left in green, you're going to see a box that says aromatase upregulation. Mm-hmm. What happens with aromatase upregulation is in the male, this causes a conversion of their testosterone into estrogen. In fact, you'll see just directly north of the aromatase upregulation box, you're going to see it says estrogen dominance. So over the years, one of the things I've seen with the males is when we test them, we find high levels of estrogen and low levels of testosterone. And at the same time, if we look coming out of the insulin resistance box, kind of to the bottom left, we're going to see androgen dominance. And a lot of times we see this with the females. We'll see high levels of androgens causing irregular cycles, hormone dysregulation. I mean, the list really goes on and on. So these are just a few of the things. I don't want to spend all the time we have here on all the boxes, but you can see that cortisol is very far-reaching. And one of the things that I think is interesting with this particular group, and this was just a study I found not too long ago, Steve. It was by the Occupational Environmental Medicine Journal. I think this was 2014. And what they showed is that there is almost a 50% drop in blood glucose in less than 3 hours in people who work standing up. This is all the dentists and the team members. So we'll go back a couple slides here and remember that cortisol is a hormone that's released during stress or I should say, and or during times of blood sugar drops. So one of the things that we see with the dentists is that they are on their feet all day. I think that it's common to see that they don't fuel themselves all day, or they fuel themselves very poorly and they can't make it from one meal to the next without creating a cortisol stress response. I think that's one of the biggest things that I'm seeing. So let's go on to the next slide. And these are the common symptoms. Over the last, I believe it's been about 17, 18 years that I've worked with you guys, the Crown Council, and been a resource partner. These are the top things that I see in speaking with you all. Fatigue. And we see this, we get comments about, Jack, I can have an 8 to 10 hour, night's sleep, and I'm still fatigued.
Yeah.
Obviously, fatigue, lethargy in the afternoons. We talk to people who, comment poor mental focus. They can't concentrate as well as they used to. Obviously, weight gain or difficulty losing weight. We see over here in the right column, allergies, arthritic issues, inflammatory issues, hormonal imbalances, menstrual, menopausal, andropause, all these things, and they can all have a direct correlation to high stress. Many of the folks that I talk to, they have to have coffee to get started. And, it's tough for me to suggest that they do something otherwise. So they depend on that. They crave sweets. Overall, they don't feel as well as they should. I've talked to many within the Crown Council who just basically say, Jack, I'm burned out. I don't know how much longer I can do this.
Yeah.
And the idea is we want to get them back in the ball game. We also see here towards the bottom, we'll see things like increased blood pressure. We'll see high cholesterol, high triglycerides. And as I mentioned earlier, diabetes and heart disease is another big factor. And it's not always just about the individual who is eating sweets and sugars and drinking alcohol, things like that. Diabetes can be caused from a long-term stress response.
Really?
Because as I said earlier, cortisol specifically desensitizes the cells to insulin. So what ultimately occurs is the more stressed you are, the more and more insulin you need to keep blood sugar within the tight parameters that the body's looking for.
Got it.
So therefore, high stress can be a direct cause of diabetes and heart disease.
Got it.
All right. So what I'm talk about now is the different types of stressors, because most everybody that I speak with, when we get into stress, and we use that word, they say, well, Jack, I got a great life. I'm not stressed.
Right.
But as you see here on the slide, there are 6 different areas. From left to right, at the top, we have inherited stress patterns, or what we would call maybe kind of genetic patterns that we picked up from mom and dad. Spiritual, mental, emotional, chemical.
Wait, Jack, wait. What's spiritual stress? You don't have any boxes under that one. What's that?
That is, that's kind of one of those that there are purposely no boxes, because that's an area that's really not for me to define to each individual. But here's what I typically say about it. I encourage people to look and find a belief system or religion, if you will, but find something that they're comfortable with, which helps them to realize simply that each of us are part of something so much bigger than just ourselves.
Gotcha.
And then I encourage them to explore the depths of their findings at whatever level that may be.
Got it. Okay.
So that's why there's nothing there. But I would also say that may be one of the most important parts of this whole thing.
Got it.
Mental, emotional stress, as I mentioned, we have chemical stress, structural stress, and external energy field disturbances. So I'm going to come back to these because I want to talk briefly about the thing that I see probably most often with the membership, and that is down here under chemical stress at the very bottom, dysglycemia. Let's talk a little bit about dysglycemia. Basically, it's an inability of the body to maintain normal serum glucose levels, or a failure to maintain homeostasis. We see this with hypoglycemia or low blood sugar symptoms, and we see it again with insulin resistance, also known as syndrome X, metabolic syndrome, or ultimately diabetes. So what this is and kind of how it plays out is basically the individual may overuse or abuse sugars and starches, sweets. What happens is the receptor sites fail to respond to the insulin signal. So therefore, the pancreas says, well, okay, if you're not going to listen to this small amount of insulin that I secreted, I'll just overwhelm you by pumping out more.
Gotcha.
So the excess insulin then overwhelms the resistance of the cell and basically comes flooding in. And what typically happens is the blood sugar falls, and usually it falls too low because now it has this overabundance of insulin, so it drops. And this is why some people, oftentimes they'll tell me, they say, Jack, I can be going along, and then it feels like somebody pulls a plug and the bottom just falls out.
Yep.
So what has to happen then is the adrenal glands have to compensate by producing cortisol to raise blood sugar. Now, we say, well, that's great. We've got a protective mechanism. The problem is that cortisol catabolizes muscle mass. So it literally robs Peter to pay Paul. The cortisol catabolizes the muscle mass, converts it to fuel, and raises the fuel gauge, and that's how it basically saves your life. It keeps you from going too low of blood sugar, at which point you could slip into a let's say low blood sugar coma, the adrenals catabolizing your muscle tissue. So over the years, I've had people tell me, they go, well, Jack, it's interesting. I'm not gaining any weight or losing any weight, but what I'm really seeing is I'm seeing changes in my body composition. I'm losing tone. I'm losing kind of the strength that I used to have, and I can see that I'm getting more flabby.
Right.
So as you see at the very bottom, the process starts all over again, because oftentimes what will happen is within a couple hours later, the person may be able to make it to that next donut or candy bar or soda water, whatever it may be. And it goes on and on.
Got it.
It starts all over. So this is kind of a picture. I'm going to give you a visual here of what we're talking about. We can see on this chart high, normal, and low. Obviously, we want to be in this green shaded area. And if we are eating the high sugar foods, high starch, high sugars, whatever it may be, we're going to be kind of following the outline here of these red lines. We're going to be down and then up and down and up, and it just basically cycles like this throughout the day. Whereas
the highs are high and the lows are low.
That's right. And to point out, every time that you see a high point here, that's when the body is pumping in excess insulin.
Yeah.
Excess insulin stores body fat, increases triglycerides and cholesterol, and so on and so forth. As the insulin comes pouring in, it drops us down to low. Now we pump in more cortisol, which now creates more muscle wasting. And like I said, the process just kind of goes on and on. And with high cortisol or chronic elevated cortisol, which is often used to counteract this low blood sugar, it also affects neurotransmitters. So high cortisol decreases serotonin, one of the neurotransmitters. That's very common. Most people are aware of that one. And therefore, we don't have near the balance between inhibitory versus excitatory neurotransmitters. So the likelihood that we're going to see things like depression and anxiety is very great whenever we're seeing imbalances in blood sugar.
Interesting correlation. Okay.
So let's go back to these 6 vectors of stress, because we certainly, as much as possible, want to give you all kind of an idea about what these are, and maybe more importantly, what we can do to try to help reduce them as much as possible. Because the goal is to look at all of these 6, see where each person may or may not kind of fall into it, and see what we can do to help lessen the load here. Because the more and more that we can lessen the load, the less and less stress response we have. And let me be very clear on something that I failed to mention earlier. It doesn't matter if a person has a mental stress versus a chemical stress versus a inherited genetic stress or even a physical trauma. The stress response is the exact same. It's the exact same. As a matter of fact, they've done studies to show that a person can go back and simply relive, with mental imagery, relive a stressor from 20 years ago, and they can stimulate the exact same stress patterns as what actually occurred to them during the event 20 years earlier.
Okay.
So we want to certainly, I guess, lessen the load where we can. So we'll go to the top here that we started with earlier with spiritual. And as I mentioned, the idea is to just explore the fact that there's so much more to each of us than just ourselves. If we, let's go over here to the inherited stress patterns, where it says genetic disorders or expression and inherited toxins. The idea is we cannot change our genes, but the literature is very clear. We can change our gene expressions. So that means that just because mom and dad may have had diabetes or heart disease or arthritis or whatever it may be, doesn't mean that the next person has to have that. So what we're saying here is we want to seek to optimize our genetic expression through diet, lifestyle. We want to do what we can to reduce those negative expressions by not tripping the switch, so to speak. You know, in other words, the gun can be loaded, but we don't necessarily have to pull the trigger. That's what we want to do. We want to make sure that our genes are expressing themselves as healthily as they can.
Got it.
Probably wasn't the best example to use with everything going on down here, was it?
Hey, well, we get the idea.
Okay.
No, it can be there, but it doesn't have to. You don't have to trigger it.
That's exactly right.
Stress, right.
Let's jump over here to mental emotional stressors. You know, the biggest thing that I can offer here, and it's something that's, I mean, even myself that I deal with on a regular basis is we need to forgive. And whether it's ourselves, whether it's others, because most of the mental emotional things that we go through, there's either ourself, obviously that's involved there, and or others. So I think forgiveness is huge. But at the same time, we want to be aware of the words that we speak. Now, over the last many years, I've started moving a little more into some of these areas of health, and simply put, the words that we each use ultimately use us. So choose your words wisely.
Okay.
And what that simply means is, you know, the brain doesn't always understand. If you have something negative to say about another person, it may not understand that you're saying that to the other person. It just simply hears the words that are coming out of your mouth, and it's going right back in. So these things can play a role in continuing limiting belief patterns. So I would also say, you know, at least suggest that if this is an area of focus for each individual, you know, whoever it may be, to start looking into therapies, whether it's prayer or religion, or things like emotional freedom technique. There are things like thought field therapy. There's a lot of different things that can help a person kind of move through some of these stressful patterns. And I would certainly encourage, you know, people to look in that area. External energy field disturbances, geopathic stress, electromagnetic radiation, frequency disturbance. And this kind of pretty much explains it. What we would want to do here is we would want to limit our exposure to these things. Basically, that means electronic devices, computers, X-rays, UV radiation, artificial lighting, which, you know, I know within the dental offices, there are a lot of these things that, you know, the teams are exposed to on a regular basis. And so these are some areas that, you know, we may not always be able to get away from them, but we can certainly do everything we can to limit them where we can, and then obviously support the body's overall health to try to withstand the load on a daily basis.
Gotcha.
We'll move here to structural stress, bone deformities, physical traumas, soft tissue dysfunction. I mean, again, going back to some of the members I've talked to over the years, is the physical trauma of dentistry is great.
Yeah, it's a physically demanding profession for sure.
That's exactly right. And so a physical trauma will create the same high stress response. So let's say, you know, we have a dentist that is having some aches and pains due to the work that they're doing. They're standing up all day, as we've already established. They're doing all these things. That physical trauma creates an inflammatory response. And if it goes on long enough, it's a chronic inflammatory response. That inflammatory response drives the cortisol response. Cortisol is our natural anti-inflammatory. So therefore, physical trauma will drive high cortisol. This then would affect all those things that we've talked about previously. So obviously, I'm suggesting that, you know, people look at things like maybe orthotics, if they're having problems with their feet after a long day, ergonomic chairs and massage therapy. Obviously, we can do things from a nutritional perspective, like natural anti-inflammatory compounds to help reduce pain and inflammation, and that's very helpful. But overall, you want to assess these different areas and find, the most common factors and what can be done to solve those.
Got it.
Lastly is chemical stress. And this is probably the one that I personally see the most. We see things like metabolic waste, digestive waste, natural pollutants, man-made pollutants, biologicals, and as we already talked about, dysglycemia. So what we're really talking about here is we want to improve metabolic function of the body. We want to improve detoxification. We would like to improve digestion. One thing let me mention about detoxification, quite often when people come in to see me, they say, Jack, well, I've done all these detox programs. Well, the bottom line is this: when the person has elevated high cortisol, it basically interrupts liver detoxification. It blocks liver detoxification. So if an individual is very stressed and they say, well, maybe I'll go through one of these detox things that I pick up here at the local store, I don't care how great and wonderful it sounds, if they're having high responses to stress and high cortisol, they are not detoxifying. It can't happen. So okay. we want to improve that. We want to improve that. And the way we're going to improve detoxification is by balancing cortisol and then supporting detoxification. Certainly we want to improve digestion because, simply put, whatever you're putting in, if it's not digesting, well, I have news for you. It's sitting there and it's rotting and it's putrefying. And so as it decomposes in your gut, it's creating allergy responses. Yeah. And what the body's going to do to that is respond with an inflammatory response, once again, causing high cortisol and stress issues. So this is why the next box here, which says natural environmental pollutants, we're talking about allergies. So pollens, trees, plants, dogs, cats, whatever it may be, these types of allergens will basically create a cortisol response.
Yeah.
Man-made pollutants, we're talking about obviously chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, preservatives, drugs, things like that. Obviously viruses, bacteria, which again, the dental professional, he's right there in people's mouths, and the hygienist as well. So they're exposed to these things on a regular basis each and every day. Ultimately, we have to keep the immune system functioning as well as it can to protect the body. And what occurs with high cortisol is when cortisol is pumped out, it basically tells the immune cells to stay put. It says, we're in a stress pattern and we're not worried about defending ourselves at this point. We could care less about immune function. We're concerned with survival. So basically it tells the immune system, sit down and shut up until I get things stabilized, and then we'll let you come out and do your business. Well, the problem is that people have stress responses that occur throughout the day. So for each stress response, we have an immune system that's basically suppressed for 3 to 5 hours. So the problem is we never get a chance to really protect ourselves. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the, my take on these 6 vectors and what we want to do to try to unload the stress responses on each individual and give them a chance to either maintain or regain their health.
So if you were to go through real quick to wrap up these 6 areas and do an overall prescription, inherited stress, there are things you can do to try and heal the system so they don't trigger the spiritual stress. You've talked very well about that in terms of kind of finding your way and getting grounded there. The mental, emotional stress, forgiveness and really working on the mental side of things. Watch your environment. That's the external, the external part. The structural piece, that's, keeping your body in good shape. And then the chemical stress, that's all about, what goes in.
That's
managing your diet and everything that goes along. So these, what helped me, Jack, and the reason that I asked you to do this was, there's a lot of conversation about stress, and we typically think of stress as, a stressful situation and, having to work hard and, multiple demands on our time. And that's just one field, one area of 6. Right. That's really putting stress on the entire system. So one of the fascinating things that you've helped me with and a lot of other people is if I want to know where I am in this whole scheme of things and how really balanced I am, how do I know how healthy I am in this area? Share with us that to wrap up here.
in this area of stress, or in like each one of these areas?
I just overall, if I've got a stress response that I may or may not even be aware of, how do I know?
So a couple of things that I like to use. Number one is a questionnaire that I put together a few years ago, which takes these 6 categories and breaks them down into just some individual components. And based on how you score, can kind of at least give you some indication that these are some areas you need to look at. So that's one thing I use. The other thing is I use a salivary test called the Adrenal Stress Index, which measures the cortisol response as well as several other indices to give us a pretty good look at how the adrenals are holding up in the long-term stress pattern of each individual. And then obviously, I think one of the best things is just a good case history. I mean, I sit down with a person in an hour, I know an awful lot about them, and a lot of times I can pinpoint where their stressors are coming from. So those are probably the couple, 3 things that I use the most.
If somebody wanted to do one or more of those, tell us how they can reach you.
Give me a call. Obviously, they have my resource information more than likely. And give us a call here at the office. And I think the best place to start, obviously, is with a case history. It's as simple as calling us, setting up a time. It takes about an hour. And we go through a thorough case history during that time. And at that point, based on what I'm hearing, I will then see if I can't connect the dots for them. And then we set a plan from where we go from there, as far as let's run an adrenal stress index. Maybe we look at a good comprehensive blood test to give us some information in other areas, whether it's cholesterol, triglycerides, maybe looking at liver values, those types of things. But I think the first step would be let's get a time to talk and see where we are.
All right. So Jack's phone number is area code 830-896-0550. 830-896-0550. Metabolic and Nutritional Assessments is Jack's company name. And this, to me, what you've encapsulated here is one of the most instructive things. I mean, this whole stress response and all the different areas that it comes from, and then what it results in, I think is one of the really key things if you're going to stay healthy and be active, especially doing dentistry for a long time. This is a big part of the equation. So Jack, thanks for all your help over the years with the many Crown Council members that you've helped navigate through their stressful lives and help them be healthier and continue to do good and produce great dentistry and help other people. And thanks for continuing to do that as we move forward.
I thank you, Steve, for the opportunity to visit with you guys, and it's been a real joy and pleasure over the last 18 years of working with you guys. So thank you for that, and I look forward to continuing that.
You got it. Thanks, Jack. Have a great day.
Take care.
And anybody needs help, give Jack Fairchild a call. Thanks for joining us on the Crown Council Mentor of the Month.